Okay, let's go ahead and get started on this topic of time and uncertainty. You've certainly covered a lot of ground in the week already, talking about the basic fundamentals of human action and ends and means, and kind of structuring of means into higher order capital structure. All the causal laws that relate valuing to this process of economizing, and how this is done through pricing, and the problems of socialism and interventionism and business cycles and so on and so forth. And in this lecture, we want to start back at the beginning on the basic idea of time in human action, and how this integrates, how our discussion here can integrate into this framework that you've been building throughout the week. And some of these topics you've already been exposed to, obviously, but we want to go somewhat systematically from the basic points on through to the more complicated. And we'll divide this into, the same way the title is. We'll talk about time first and the implications of time itself, and then uncertainty, and obviously then, along with uncertainty, entrepreneurship and error, and topics related to those things. Now, Mises makes a very interesting claim at the first basic point about time. He says, there's a distinction between the way that we understand time in human action and clock time. So clock time is just the past and the present moment that vanishes from one moment to the next into the past, right? And the future. So the present, in terms of clock time, is just this vanishing moment, right? It's not really a span of time or a period of time, but just constantly passing moment into the past. And what Mises points out is that from the viewpoint of human action, of course, we have a different set of concepts about time. We divide time differently. And we divide time into the three categories of, if this is a time line, of before action, during action, and after action. To say this differently, these are all choice variables for us, right, as human beings. We decide on the timing of the action. We decide where to place our action in time. We decide the duration of the action. We decide the component aspects of this period we call during the action. So as he sometimes puts it in human action, he says the present, from the viewpoint of human action, is a span of time in which we're designing our action and placing it in the flux of time. Now, within this period of the period during the action, then we have further categorizations, further divisions. We have the period of production. So this includes what Mises calls the working time, right? The stages of production where we're going through the processes of producing the intermediate capital goods and then eventually the consumer good. And then maturing time. So for some goods, once we produce the consumer good, it requires some time of waiting for the good to mature, like wine that's fermenting, or crops that are being stored, or examples of this sort. So there's this period of production, right? And again, this point here is that these are all choice variables for us. We decide what is the period of production, how do we structure the production from the higher orders to the lower orders, and so on. And then there's the duration of service, the duration of service of the good that's produced. So this too, or the durability, as we might say, of the good. So this too is a choice variable for us. We can produce consumer goods that are more durable, right? Why? Well, because we're interested in stretching out this period of action to get the benefit, 10 years from now of the good, or goods that are less durable. And as Mises makes a point of saying, these are categories of action that relate to time that are important in our choosing with respect to time. These aren't historical concepts that we use to analyze historical events. although we could do that too. But they're praxeological notions. This is important because Böhm-Bawerk was mistaken about this idea, right? He had the notion of the average period of production, which Mises points out is looking at the past. And this is incorrect. What we formulate these concepts to do is to aid us in understanding how people are choosing now in anticipation of the future. So, an illustration of this would be something like, let's say my wife and I want to have a house built. And so when we do this, right, we're concerned about the period of production, duration of the service of the good, or serviceability of the good. These are all choice variables for us. So we decide, let's start building the house on January 15th of 2003, and we'll finish 6 months later or 8 months later. Right, this is our plan. There's a certain steps of the production process. So the land is cleared and the foundation is dug out, and the guys come and pour the cement. Right. Well, I mean, we don't plan all of this. We leave this to the construction guys, but we have this all, right? We understand the process of how this all takes place. This could be stretched out in time. The period of production could be lengthened out, right? We could wait longer and, extend out the process, and pay maybe a different price for that sort of thing. The durability of the house then depends upon the quality of the materials we use. This too we choose, right? We say, maybe marble is a bit too expensive for the floors in the foyer and whatever. We can just get away with tile, and even though it's not going to last for 1,000 years, it's suitable for us, and so on. And so this is the way in which these concepts are usable to us. Now, in planning action. Now, as Mises points out, there's also the period of provision. What we might call the planning horizon for our actions, the period over which we plan for an action to take place. And again, we choose this. So sometimes these periods of provision are very short. I'm only concerned with where I'm going to go and how long it will take and so on, what production process I'll use to get lunch. So the period of provision is only maybe an hour long. Then there are other actions for which the period of provision could be beyond my lifetime. So raising your children, you're anticipating accomplishing certain effects that may occur even after your death, that their grandchildren will be of a certain character or what have you, right? So periods of provision are also a choice variable for us. We have to think this through. This is part of acting. This is how time relates to our action, right? This is a different dimension, again, from what we've been speaking about before. Now, I'll take quick questions, but no long stuff. We've got lots to go through. Yeah, period of provision is a time over which we plan for an action. Okay, and then Mises points out, this is, this seems fairly basic, but here he makes a rather provocative claim. He says when we think about time in human action, we think about it in the categories of sooner and later. We do not think about, or it's not appropriate, I mean, we could mistakenly think in inappropriate ways. It's not appropriate for us to think about time in terms of more or less time with respect to action. And why is this? Well, he says the reason for this is because time is, as he calls it, an irreversible flux. From the human perspective of acting, right, time just passes by one moment to the next, to the next, to the next. We can't store it up. Right? It isn't like a factor of production to us. We can't accumulate it and then expend it. It's simply always passing by. It's kind of, so to speak, in the background as we're acting. And because of this, we cannot conceive of the way that we think in human action about time as if it were a factor of production. Right? Because we can't allocate it like a factor of production. We can't say, now I've stored, I've saved up $100 and now I'm going to go out and buy a new pair of shoes. No, time is just always passing by. We have to adjust our action to the flux of time. And in doing this, the basic distinction that we make is between sooner and later. Okay, so this is the innovative thing I think that he's saying here. Okay, now with respect to sooner and later, when we think about these concepts with respect to time, we want to apply them to the two different valuations that we do with respect to time. two separate aspects of valuing time. And we have to think about this valuation with respect to sooner and later. Okay, the first of these, we talk about valuing time in human action. We might call economizing time. Or more precisely, it's economizing our action with respect to time. Now remember before we said that economizing is just, with a given means, we strive to attain higher valued ends, or for a given end that we're striving to attain, we attempt to do it with lower cost means, right? We're always striving to get the greater value out of our action. So the question then becomes, is it possible for us to perceive in a given action that there's a greater value that would accrue to us if we take the action sooner or later? Right? And if it's true that the action would give us greater value later, then, or enough greater value later at least, then we would choose to do it later. Economizing would mean we would do it later. Now, a silly kind of illustration of this would be my son, who some of you may have seen at the conference, he's attending some of the lectures, is 16. And his birthday is in November, and so he'll be 17 in November, right? And my wife and I would have a birthday party for him, right? Like we do every year, and we'd get his friends together and give him some presents and so on and so forth. Well, depending upon the day we choose to hold his birthday, it will have more or less value. They'll hold the party, right? It would have more or less value. If we did it tomorrow, it would have less value than if we did it on his birthday. Sometimes in the past, we haven't held his birthday party on his birthday because it's been in the middle of the week, and so his friends can't get together, right? There's not enough time or whatever for them to have an afternoon of, being together and doing whatever it is they do. And so we'd hold it on the weekend. Why? Why do we choose to have it Saturday instead of Wednesday? Why do we choose to have it later instead of sooner in time? Why do we allocate the action into time at that point? Well, because it has greater value. Right? So this is economizing time. Now, the way in which our actions, when we economize our actions with respect to time, manifests itself in the market, of course, is in futures markets. Right? So we have the present price of oil and the future price of oil. And so if the future price of oil is higher because people anticipate it being scarcer in the future price reflects that difference in value, right? So this manifests itself in the market in the same way that any economizing choice that we make would manifest itself in the market. Any demand. In other words, let's say people now value hybrid cars more than they do SUVs. So what do? Because they're getting greater value, they switch their demand to the hybrids, the price goes up, right? Relative to the SUVs, their price sinks. Same thing here. There's no right. So this is just how we would see economizing with respect to time manifest in the market. It would be in futures markets. Prices in the future could be, of course, higher than they are in the present if people think that future uses are greater value, or they could be lower. The futures prices could be below present prices, right? If people think that present uses of the resources are worth more than future uses. So there's no necessary relationship between present prices and future prices with respect to this economizing feature of acting. Okay, now the other way in which we value with respect to sooner and later is, of course, time preference. And you've been introduced to this idea before, so let's carry on from the basic points of time preference to the more complicated. And we might say, just to start this discussion, that since these two things are separable, conceptually separable, right, we can analyze them separately, then in any particular action, they're going to be combined. Just like we say we have, certain underlying preferences that we have for particular goods that are always working themselves out, let's say, in our actions. But there are other factors are also involved in creating a particular result. Again, let's say, beginning students sometimes get confused about this particular point. We say there's a law of demand, and we've shown the basis of this. Right? Well, the law of demand is always an underlying principle of acting that's affecting the way that we act. But does this mean that prices that The only time we see in markets that greater quantities are purchased is when prices are lower? No, it's not, right? The demand curve could shift to the right for a good. The demand could go up, in which case we'd see higher prices associated with larger quantities. Now, does this contradict the law of demand? No, not at all. Not at all. They're both functioning in our minds or in our actions, and it's easy to see how they're reconcilable. Well, it's the same thing here. Right? These are always, we're operating on, with all these principles of valuation synchronously in our actions. And so it's no contradiction to, there's no necessary contradiction between these two. We can reconcile them. And we wish to show just in a few cases how this reconciliation takes place. Anyway, let's start at the beginning. So we have time preference, we say. Time preference is the preference a person has for a given satisfaction sooner as opposed to the same satisfaction later. You notice this is a ceteris paribus claim. And then Mises goes through various arguments as to why this would be so. The first is that he says, well, every time we act, we're choosing to satisfy the end sooner. Every action demonstrates time preference. Because we could always, with respect to this particular action, have put it off into the future. We didn't. We acted now. And the very fact that we act we choose, we say, yes, this is now what I pursue, demonstrates that we have time preference. As Mises points out in this particular line of argument, that time preference is a feature of all temporal beings. Animals have time preference as well as human beings. This is his claim. You can chew on that a while, but in other words, he's saying that the reason we have time preference, it's a categorical feature of the temporal existence of human nature. That's where it comes from. We must have time preference because it must be the case that we choose to act in the present. And when we do that, since we could have chosen otherwise, we're always demonstrating time preference. And then he gives counterexamples, right? What would happen if we didn't have time preference? And then points out the absurdity of these things that we would see if we didn't have time preference. So he says, for example, what if we never preferred the sooner over later, we saw them the same. We didn't care, in other words, whether we had a particular satisfaction sooner or later. It didn't matter to us at all. Well, then he says, if that were true, if we had no preference between the two, then we would always engage in the longest, most productive production processes possible. We wouldn't consume in the present, right? We would invest everything in the present in order to have more consumption goods in the future, since we were indifferent between having them, a particular consumption good in the present and the future. Why? Because more is always preferred to less in terms of goods. So if we can invest in a long production process and get more goods in 10 years from now, that would always have to be considered better than getting fewer goods through a shorter production process as an option, if we had no time preference. So he said, well, we don't do this, right? Obviously what we do in real life is we choose the shortest, most productive production processes first. Those are the most ideal. But we only do this because we have time preference. If we preferred later over sooner, then obviously we would never consume. Right? I would always prefer the ham sandwich tomorrow. When I got to tomorrow, I'd prefer it tomorrow. Right? If I always preferred a future consumption, I always thought the value would be greater later. So obviously we do consume. We consume in the present. We're demonstrating, as we pointed out before, time preference. So it's important to say that time preference then is not a psychological aspect of acting any more than preference itself is. We're not saying that different psychological dispositions might not affect people's rates of time preference, right? Just like different personalities could affect the degree to which we prefer steak over fish or other goods. We're just saying as a conceptual aspect of acting, time preference is, as Mises would say, categorical, just like preference is. It's also not physiological. That is, it doesn't arise from physiological need. It arises, as Mises claims, from just temporal existence. even for physiological goods for which we have physiological need, let's say consuming water, we still have time preference. We still choose, in other words, between drinking the glass of water now and drinking it in an hour, or drinking it tomorrow, or what have you. Now, he also points out that coupled with time preference as a feature of acting in our world is a fact of the natural world. And the fact of the natural world that he likes to integrate into time preference at the beginning of this discussion is the fact that production processes with the shortest possible periods of production do not satisfy all of our ends. The shortest periods of production would be things like picking fruit off of trees, to catching fish with your bare hands, this sort of thing. Well, those sorts of production processes that are available to us do not satisfy all of our ends. We have ends beyond this. Right? And as soon as we have ends beyond this, then time preference enters into how we choose between striving toward those production goods that we can produce with longer periods of production and goods that we can have with shorter periods of production. The sooner-later distinction becomes relevant. And as he points out, well, I already said this, I guess, but the point that he makes next is that given the array of options available to us in producing goods in any situation of acting, therefore it follows, because of time preference, that we'll always choose the most productive, shortest production processes. So all those are already been chosen, they're already in use. And therefore any extension of production activity must go to longer, more productive production processes, right? We'll never choose longer, less productive production processes. They may be available to us, but we won't choose them. The only course open to us are longer, more productive production processes. This is why, as you've heard already in the business cycle theory, the credit expansion by the central bank lengthens the structure of production. Why does it lengthen the structure of production? Well, it has to. Any capital accumulation process has to lengthen out the structure of production. Why? Because we've already adopted the shortest, most productive production processes. All that's left to us are longer, more productive production processes. So there must be a lengthening out. Okay, now let me deal with some of the cases of alleged exceptions to time preference. And again, I think most of the confusion here about are there or are there not exceptions to time preference stems from the disregard of the categorical nature, as Mises would say, of these concepts. Remember, preference is a fundamental category of acting, and so it's not like we can dispense with it and still have acting. And so there can be no exceptions to this. In other words, we use the word preference just to refer to the state of mind a person has in its valuing when he chooses in action. And, okay, so his action can never contradict his preferences. What he says can contradict his preferences. What he wishes for, that could contradict his preferences, but not what he does, because that's how we define preference. And we define preference this way because it's meaningful to define it this way. It makes sense to define it this way. Therefore, we can say as a conclusion that every action conforms to preference. Now we have a notion, right, that brings meaning to action, any and every action. So I give this example to my undergraduate students, usually on an exam. And, so it's this example, you have a guy who's smoking cigarettes. He's lighting up a cigarette and taking a drag, and he says, I wish I could kick this habit. This is a dirty, filthy habit, and I hate it. But he's smoking a cigarette. And so, the question is, what does he prefer to do? Well, the answer is he prefers to smoke. Right? Why? Well, this is just how we use the word in economics. For whatever, he may hate it, he may wish he wasn't doing it, but he does it. And therefore, he prefers it. Same with time preference. Time preference is categorical. So you would expect at the outset not to be able to find any exceptions to it, simply because of the way you define it. And therefore all the exceptions should be, we should be skeptical about them. Okay, well, what are some of these? One that Mises deals with is, let's suppose we have a person and he's given the opportunity to go to two movies. He's given two movie tickets, or someone is offering 2 movie tickets to him, but unfortunately for him, they're on the same night. They're both for Friday night. And then he says, "Oh, I wish the one of the movie tickets was for Saturday night. I prefer the future." Right? I prefer to have that later and not sooner. Is this a contradiction of time preference? And Mises says, well, no, this is just inherent in the nature of scarcity of things. Right? This isn't a time preference question at all. He's just saying, I have 2 options in the present, and they're scarce to me, and I can only do one, and isn't it a shame that I can't do both of them? Okay, so this example doesn't even have to do with time preference. Another kind of case is one that could be solved by seeing that what's really being posed in the example is the existence of 2 different goods, even though it's the appearance of the same thing. So the famous example of this is ice in the winter and ice in the summer. So in the wintertime, a person might say, I have a given amount of a big block of ice that I could use. I would prefer to have it in the summer. In other words, I prefer the later to the sooner. Is this a contradiction of time preference if I prefer a block of ice in the summer? I wish I had it in July when it's February. Well, no. Why? Well, one reason might be that the person considers ice in the winter a complementary good to ice in the summer. It might be that what he has in mind is to take the block of ice, put it in his refrigerator, and store it for summer use. Well, we know that every good that is a consumer good must have a greater value than the factors of production. So that's not a contradiction of time preference, right? That's just a natural, necessary relationship of the value of ends to the value of means. So this again is not a contradiction. Well, what if we don't have that possibility? What if the guy's not interested in taking ice as a factor of production and producing ice as a consumer good in some future period? Well, then, as we pointed out before, we have economizing questions to take into account, right? A person could prefer a future block of ice to a present block of ice, but maybe this is because he's economizing. This wouldn't contradict his time preference. It breaks the ceteris paribus condition, under which we state time preference, which is a given satisfaction today or sooner is preferred to the same satisfaction later. Right? It doesn't say that there couldn't be a greater satisfaction that we could obtain in the future. So with ice, for example, ice in the summer, it might be simply a question of diminishing marginal utility. I have a lot of ice in the winter, and so a unit of it isn't worth very much to me. I don't have very much in the summer. A unit of it is worth more to me. That doesn't contradict time preference, right? It might be that what the person has in mind when he makes a claim like this is that the valuation depends upon the opportunities for using the good. So, for example, he says in February, I would never use ice to sit out on the veranda and drink iced tea. Right? So there's a use that I would put it to in the summer that I won't put it to in the wintertime. I'm economizing. I'm choosing to use the ice in the summertime precisely because there's a more valuable use to which I can put it, right? That's just economizing. It does not contradict time preference. And we might say that even if the person had the same end in mind, even if he isn't, economizing toward a different action that gives him a greater value, it might be that the same action would give him greater value, like my example, the birthday party, in the future as opposed to the present, right? So if I take ice, I put it into a glass of iced tea, and I go out into the howling blizzard, on the veranda at my house and drink iced tea, well, that's not a very pleasurable experience. It certainly isn't the same satisfaction that I would get from doing the same thing in the blazing hot July summer. Right? So maybe I value ice in the summer more simply because I'm economizing. And this would be no contradiction of time preference. Okay, so let's go on to the other main thing we want to say about time preference, which is its relationship to the rate of interest. So time preference, we know, is manifests in the what Mises calls the originary rate of interest, what Rothbard calls the pure rate of interest, the premium that we place upon the present versus the future. Now, here we have a seeming quandary. We can understand how a person in his mind has time preference. Okay, we can assent to this and see the reasonableness of it. But how how can this be isolated in the market so that we can see it manifest in the market? Because we said before, when people trade things in the present for things in the future, like I trade a barrel of oil in the present for a barrel of oil in the future, or I make a futures contract for delivery of oil in the future, well, the future price could be higher or it could be lower than the present price. Because I'm making this trade on the basis of what I think the value will be to the consumer or the user of the oil in the future. So is it always the case that any time I trade something in the present for something in the future, I have this economizing element, and therefore I could have either a higher price in the future or a lower price, or maybe the same price? Can I ever make a trade where I isolate the time preference element? That becomes a very interesting question, right? Sort of a fundamental question about this. Okay, well, Mises says, look, we can, in fact, have trade to isolate the time preference element. We can find a trade of certain things where we can be fairly assured that the economizing element does not exist in this trade. And this is the trade of money. Trade of present money for future money. When we trade present money for future money, the usefulness of money as a medium of exchange we don't expect to be any different in the future. If we do, we'd build it into our exchange rate, but that's a separable question. We can at least conceptually isolate this factor, right? There doesn't seem to be any reason to think as a necessity of valuing things that we would have to have an economizing content to the trade of money, to the usefulness of future money. Now, let's suppose we did. If we did, then wouldn't we already allocate money? Wouldn't we be in the process of already shifting money toward the higher valued use? Just like we do in the present, right? We do this all the time in the present. We take money and we spend it on what we think is higher valued, and then diminishing marginal utility lowers the value of spending additional money in that line of consumption, and so we do it in another line of consumption, right? And what have we done? Well, we've created a rough similarity of the different value, the marginal utility of money, of the things that we could acquire with money, I should say, in every different line of activity. And we've equalized the economizing difference that exists then, right? Because we can arbitrage money across all different expenditures. And therefore we wouldn't think that there would be any differential of money's value based upon economizing. This has already been taken into consideration in the way that we allocate money. We've already done this, and therefore it's washed out, right? This effect doesn't exist when we trade present money for future money. Okay, so for these reasons, Mises says we can have a presumption, at least. Again, there might be special cases where this isn't so, but when we think about the fundamental of just these two factors, we can see that money trade, the trade of present money for future money, could, in fact, isolate the time preference element. Okay, so this is where we get his principle, right, of the connection between the two. So we would have a preference rank, and on the preference rank we would have, let's say, $1,000 of money today, valued above 1,000 in 1 year. Say for some particular person, this would be his exhibition of time preference. He values the present $1,000 more than the future $1,000, the later receipt of it. But there might be some amount of money, say $1,250 in 1 year, that he's willing to accept in exchange for 1,000 a day. He prefers it. Maybe it's $2,000, maybe it's $5,000. I mean, hypothetically, we could think of some amount of money for us personally that we would be willing to accept in exchange for a certain amount of present money. Well, okay, once we know this, we can say there's a premium then that this person has that he places upon present money. It's $250 for 1,000. He wants $250 above the present sum of 1,000 in order to trade away the 1,000 to get the future sum. Right? The 250 is his premium on the present. Now somebody else might have a different premium, right? Somebody might hold out for $1,500 in a year. before they'd be willing to trade 1,000 today to get the future sum. And so that person's time preference premium would be $500 for 1,000. Okay, and then there could be some people with lower time preference intensities. They'd be willing to accept smaller premiums. But all the premiums that people are willing to accept are positive. Right? No negative premiums. That's ruled out by the categorical existence of time preference. Okay, so this is the way that the connection would be made to the market. So there could be, now remember the last step of this analysis, just in schematically speaking, we start with preferences, we see what demands and supplies would be, and then we get market clearing, right? We get trade. So how does trade come about in present money for future money? It comes about when people have different premiums. So we have one person who's willing to pay, let's say, a $250 premium to acquire $1,000 today. He's willing to make this trade, right, either way. And then we have another person maybe who's willing to accept a $100 premium today in order to surrender $1,000 to receive $1,100 in 1 year. This person's willing to pay $1,250 in a year to get $1,000 today. Well, they could make a mutually advantageous trade, right? At any interest payment between $100 and $250. Okay, so we just have, the general principle of reverse preferences or different preferences that come into play that create mutually advantageous exchange. And then, well, when all these people get together in markets, the price they will adjust the price so that the market clears. So this is no different, right, than any other market. The interest rate will emerge just in the same way that it does in any market. We have the time market and the pure rate of interest, and the interplay of demand, those who are demanding present money and those who are supplying present money in the time market. Quick question.
What are the reasons why people prefer now than the other than what are the reasons why?
Well, we're not going to go into all the reasons and all the different aspects that enter into the time market. All we want to do is lay the foundation here to talk about time preference as one aspect of why people prefer present money. There are other aspects of why they would prefer present money. There could be speculative reasons, there could be purchasing power, money reasons, and so on and so forth. In this particular lecture, we don't want to take the time to go into that. We're just kind of laying, again, the groundwork of how you would proceed from the basic analysis to those more complicated questions. So maybe after the lecture's over, we could talk about that as an extension of what we're discussing. Okay, so now we have the time market, right? And the next step would be to see how the time market, what manifestations we have of the time market in the market economy. And as Rothbard points out, there are two basic subcomponents or parts of the time market. They're credit markets, in which this trade takes place. So the time market is divisible into the credit markets. And as he points out, the credit transaction is one that's not fulfilled until the future. And so these are loans, right? Contractual loans. So the contract itself is not consummated until the future time. That's what distinguishes a credit transaction from a cash transaction. So in the credit markets, then, we could have two possibilities. We could have consumer loans, where the borrowed money goes to buy consumer goods. And then we could have producer loans, where the borrowed money goes to purchase producer goods. Yeah, the credit transaction is one that's not completed until the future. So I lend you $1,000 for a year. When we start the transaction, I give you the $1,000, the transaction is not complete until that future time when you pay me back. A cash transaction is completed in the present. So I pay you $1,000 and you sell me a suit of clothes. Okay, so there's the credit markets, and then there's the capital structure, or the production structure, right? Where capitalist entrepreneurs are paying owners of factors of production present money, then using the factors of production to produce goods, capital goods or consumer goods, and then in the future selling, or when the production process is finished, selling the output. So this too is a trade of present money for future money, right? Or at least it has a time market dimension to it. Two cash transactions in this case. So the paying of the wages and the buying of the materials and so on and so forth sooner than the production process and the receipt of the revenues from the sale of the output later. So there's, obviously this is part of the time market, and there must be, therefore, an interest element to the capital structure. So this is what we want to turn to now. How does this interest element manifest itself in the capital structure? Again, it's pretty easy to see how this is done in the credit markets, right? We've already done the brief analysis of this. The more difficult part is the capital structure. Okay, well, it's done in the following fashion. Let's take a numeric example just to illustrate this. Let's suppose that we have a production process that uses three different factors of production. Uses a capital good that has a certain marginal revenue product that will be realized from the sale of the good, let's say in 1 year. And then there's a land resource and labor. Right? So we have an entrepreneur. He has a production process. He's using three different inputs. And he estimates that their marginal revenue product, the revenue that will be generated from the productivity of these inputs, to be received from the consumer in 1 year will be as follows. For the capital, he estimates $10,000. For the land element or the natural resource, $5,000. For the labor, $2,500. So that's what he expects to receive in a year. He expects to receive a total of $1,750 when he sells this good, this output, in 1 year. Now let's suppose that the pure rate of interest is 25%, annualized. Then the question is, what would he pay today? How much will he pay today to buy these inputs in order to produce a good that he'll sell for $1,750 in 1 year? Okay, well this is then the discounted marginal revenue product of these inputs. The marginal revenue product discounted by the 25% pure rate of interest. So we just do the discount. He'd be willing to pay $8,000 to get the marginal revenue product of the capital good. That's a 25% discount. So he could take $8,000, put it on interest at 25%. He'd get $10,000 at the end of a year. He'd be willing to pay $4,000 for the natural resource and $2,000 for the labor input. Right? And so the sum that he's willing to pay here is $14,000. So he pays $14,000 to buy the inputs today, engages in production, produces a good, sells it for $1,750 in a year. And notice his net income, $1,750 minus the 14. Whoops. His net income of $3,500 is a 25% rate of return on his $14,000. Right? If it wasn't, of course, then there'd be arbitrage of capital either into or out of this particular production process. In other words, if he's earning a greater interest return on this particular production process, maybe selling for $20,000 here, as opposed to the going rate of interest that can be earned throughout the time market in other places. Instead of $3,500, he's earning $5,000, and therefore he's earning $5,000 on $14,000, which is a higher rate of interest. Then other capitalists and entrepreneurs would enter into this business. Right? They'd buy up the capital, or they'd bid for the capital, bidding up the value of his of assets, and therefore bidding up his costs. Right? They'd force him to pay more for this capital good or for his natural resources. His costs would be bid up, and the rate of interest would be normalized again, right? Through this arbitraging activity of the capitalist and the entrepreneur. Okay, so we see how the interest rate then manifests itself throughout the time market. It manifests itself as a contractual rate of interest in the credit markets, and as part of net income, the interest return, if you will, to the capital invested in the production structure. Okay, now let's go on to the. And again, we're setting aside the more complicating factors here, right? We all understand that there are other components of net income besides just the interest return. And we do want to mention we do want to integrate one of these into the analysis, but this is one that comes from our discussion of uncertainty. So let's go ahead and turn to uncertainty with the rest of our time. Now, as Mises points out, for temporal finite beings, the very passage of time implies uncertainty. So it implies, in other words, that because we're finite, that we're unable to perfectly predict the future. And therefore we act only under anticipations of what might be realized in the future. This again is inherent in the time difference between saying, I wish to pursue an end, and acting in order to realize that end, right? There has to be, one has to come sooner, the decision in my mind to say, I value the end at this level of marginal utility, and then the realization of that value from my action. There has to be a time element involved. I can't instantaneously realize the value of my end. And because of that, I can only anticipate what this value will be. I don't know what it will be. It's only under uncertainty then. Or we might put the case this way. If we could imagine the absence of uncertainty, we could imagine two different states of affairs with respect to human action. One would be where the future is determined. We know exactly what's going to happen in every respect for the future. Well, clearly, if that were the case about the future, we would not be able to act because we could not formulate ends. We would just always be doing rotely what we knew we had to do, determined by whatever it was that was determining the outcome. On the other hand, if the future were completely random, where we couldn't make any sort of reasonable or somewhat accurate anticipation of the future, then in a world like that, there would be no means. Right? We would not know how to apply the things that exist in the world to the attainment of our ends, because anything could happen, right, in a purely random world where we have no ability to predict anything. So it must be that the future is uncertain, and that we grapple with this as human beings. Also, like we said with time preference, while uncertainty is categorical in human action, just like time preference is, the degrees of uncertainty are conditional. Right? They just depend upon our psychology, on the conditions under which we act, and so on and so forth, right? So the rate of time preference that a particular person has depends upon all these conditions of the real world. It could go up or down depending upon how much money he has, or other sorts of complementary goods and what have you. The same with uncertainty. It can vary from one person to another. It can vary from one action to another, and so on. Now, when we think about the types of uncertainty, or maybe I shouldn't say that. When we think about the sources of uncertainty, what is it that, from the human standpoint, generates an uncertain future? We can see that there are actually three different sources of it, and each one of them generates a different element of uncertainty. There are three. To put it differently, there are three different, categorically speaking, three different types of things that we have to be able to predict to engage in human action. One we mentioned already are, we might call them natural laws, scientific prediction. We have to be able to predict the causal connection between the use of the means and the attainment of the end. We don't know, perfectly whether this will work out. Even in cases where we're pretty sure about the working of the natural law, it might, for whatever reason, break down in this particular case. I mean, it doesn't usually do this, so we're glad of that. But so the prediction here is not very difficult, perhaps. But there still is some element of uncertainty that's introduced by this, or that still there's a residual amount of uncertainty involved in this. Then there are other aspects of action for which we can only make statistical prediction. And as Mises points out, making a statistical prediction requires that the phenomena we're trying to predict is subject to what he calls class probability. And class probability is a situation where we presume to know everything that we need to know to make a prediction about the entire class of events but nothing about each individual member of this class except that it's a member of the class. So we know everything about the class that's necessary to make a prediction, but nothing in particular about the individual element except that it's a member of this class. Now, how does situations like this play into human action? Well, we could imagine two different cases, right? One case would be where we're acting with respect to the entire class. Let's say we're an insurance company, and we're insuring all the homeowners against, who wish to be insured against the possibility of hurricanes. Well, then, all we're doing then is scientific prediction. We have some scientific knowledge of what the probability density function is, what the probability system looks like for the class of events, and then we just offer premiums on the basis of this. And as long as the customers are willing to pay this, right, they have the preference for pooling their risk and so on. Well, then this is no different than running a casino. The same thing, right? You've got the whole class of events. There's no riskiness, statistical riskiness to running a casino. Right? Sometimes you pay off big, and other nights you don't, right? But it all averages out. Why? Because you're acting with respect to the entire class of events. All right. So this is no different. No different than scientific prediction. Again, there's a certain element of residual uncertainty here with respect to this. We don't really know maybe what the probability density function is. It might shift. Especially with things like hurricanes and so on. So we might be we might have more uncertainty than we think in these cases, but again, we see the nature of uncertainty that comes from this. Now, the other possibility would be that we're just acting with respect to one of these events. I'm a homeowner and I'm just insuring my home. I'm paying the premiums, right, to insure my home against a hurricane. Now, how should we think about that? Sort of the prediction that I'm making with respect to my action in this particular case. Well, here, as Mises points out, the person doing this he likes to call it gambling. Just like the person that goes to Vegas and is playing the slots or roulette or whatever. That person is gambling, right? And the prediction they make is based just upon the numerical, statistical probability inherent in this game or inherent in this class of events. Some people like to gamble. Other people are doing this, like the homeowner presumably is doing this to pool his risk. Right? But the riskiness is of a different nature than the scientific prediction that we make, and also the third category. Now, the third category Mises calls speculation. The third category is case probability, where with case probability, we do know something about the individual event. We have some knowledge about the individual event that we're trying to predict, but not complete knowledge. And so we can't perfectly predict it, but, we can predict it with some degree of accuracy, right? Now notice the relationship between these two types of situations. If we have class probability, the best prediction we can make is just based upon what we know about the class. There isn't anything in the individual event that would give us an edge, where we could make a better prediction about that particular spin of the roulette wheel, or that particular hurricane season, or whatever it might be, right? If we could do that, then we would. Right? Then we'd have case probability, and we'd be able to make a better prediction on the basis of something we know in particular about that event that distinguishes it from the others. We know, for example, let's say we go to a casino over and over again, and we see that there's a particular dealer who has a particular pattern of hands that come out on every Friday or something. Well, then we're no longer predicting on the basis of class. Now we have a case probability instance, right? We know something in particular about this case. We can improve our prediction by going beyond what we know about the class and applying what we know in this particular case. All right, this is what Mises again calls thymology. We know something in particular. We know specific, concrete information about this event that improves our prediction. And this is, this is sort of the basic fundamental uncertainty that we have in human action. Typically, when we're dealing with other human beings or we're dealing with our own action, we're not dealing with instances of class probability, but case probability. And so we have to make predictions under uncertainty. We're engaged in speculation, as opposed to just probability risk-taking, which is a different, category of things. Well, again, how does this all play itself out, manifest itself in action and so on? And we want to take just one instance of this, and again, there are multiple applications of this. You've been exposed to some already. But we want to just take an example within our own, or extend our example that we had before. What if we wanted to add uncertainty to this example? What would then the problem look like? Because we said before that, or we implied, it was implicit in our presentation before, that these marginal revenue products are certain. We just presume to know that in a year, this in fact would be the selling price, the 1750, and that in fact these different inputs would generate through their physical productivity these marginal revenue products. But we don't know this, right? And different people might have different assessments of what these marginal revenue products will be, what the selling prices of the goods will be in a year, and therefore what the corresponding marginal revenue products will be. So let's say, just to have, carry through the example, let's say we have one entrepreneur who anticipates that if he had command over these three inputs, his anticipated marginal revenue product of the three inputs would be this pattern. So for the capital, he thinks he can employ the capital and gain a marginal revenue product of $11,000, $5,500 for the land input, $2,750 for the labor. So he thinks the selling price of his output, using the same inputs that could, that other entrepreneurs are using in different production processes, will be $19,250, not the $17,500, but he thinks he'll generate a greater value of output. So then, he's still able to pay the going discounted marginal revenue products, right? The market is still valuing these things at whatever price they happen to be, according to the discounted marginal revenue products. And so his net income would look like this. He would still pay the $14,000 to buy these inputs, but he would generate in a year $19,250 instead of the $14,000. And now his net here is $52,50. And we know conceptually that this net is made up of the $3,500 interest return. He's still paying that interest return, right? Or receiving that interest return by paying $14,000, he has to generate a 25% return just to be able to justify investing in this process. But now he has a residual for his entrepreneurial insight. Right? So he's getting $3,500 for his capital, but he's getting $1,750. The difference between $5,250 and $3,500 for his superior entrepreneurial insight. And you've probably heard this in lectures before, but remember the key in thinking about entrepreneurship, especially in the market, is that entrepreneurship is for superior foresight. It's for foresight that's better than everybody else, or better than your competitors. That's where profit is earned, right? These guys who are also correctly anticipating certain values, they're accurately anticipating being able to produce things and sell them at premiums, are not getting this profit. These guys are just earning an interest return. This guy gets the profit because he anticipates better than that there's something more valuable that these resources could be put to, and then he employs them in this manner to earn this additional profit. Okay, so I guess I've exhausted our time, so we'll do it. Thank you.